Diane Miller had seen plenty of courtroom drama in Port Charles, but this time the tension felt different. The case involving Mr. Cain had already stirred curiosity across town, and whispers filled every corner of the Metro Court. No one knew exactly what Diane was planning, but everyone agreed on one thing: she was preparing a move that could change everything. Mr. Cain's legal trouble had been mounting for weeks. Conflicting statements, missing details, and a trail of unanswered questions made the situation more complicated by the day. Many believed the case was headed toward a predictable outcome, with little room for surprises. But Diane had quietly been working behind the scenes, reviewing documents, re-interviewing witnesses, and uncovering information that had gone unnoticed. When the hearing finally began, the courtroom was packed. Familiar faces from around Port Charles filled the seats, eager to watch the proceedings unfold. The judge called the session to order, and Diane stood with calm confidence. Her expression gave nothing away, but those who knew her could sense she was holding something important. As the opposing counsel presented their arguments, it seemed like Mr. Cain's position was weakening. Observers exchanged uneasy glances, thinking the case might soon reach a disappointing conclusion. That was when Diane asked to address the court with new evidence she had recently obtained. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. The judge allowed her to proceed, and Diane carefully laid out a series of documents and statements that painted a very different picture of the situation. Each piece of information connected like a puzzle, revealing gaps in the earlier narrative and raising serious doubts about key claims made against Mr. Cain. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What had seemed straightforward now felt uncertain. Even the judge leaned forward with interest as Diane methodically explained how the overlooked details changed the entire understanding of the case. Outside the courthouse, word spread quickly. At the hospital, at Kelly's, and even at Windermere, people paused their conversations to check their phones for updates. Everyone wanted to know what Diane had uncovered. Back inside, the opposing counsel struggled to respond. Their earlier confidence faded as Diane's argument continued to gain momentum. By the time she finished, it was clear that the case was no longer heading in the direction anyone had expected. The judge announced a temporary recess to review the new material. As people filed out, the buzz of conversation filled the hallway. Some were relieved, others were confused, but all agreed that Diane had just changed the course of Mr. Cain's future. Mr. Cain quietly thanked Diane, realizing that her persistence might be the key to clearing his name. But Diane knew the battle wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning of a much larger legal fight. As the day came to a close, Port Charles was left with more questions than answers. What else might come to light, and how far would Diane go to ensure justice was served? One thing was certain: this case was far from finished, and the next chapter promised even more unexpected developments. The courthouse hallway buzzed long after the recess was called. Reporters tried to piece together what Diane had revealed, while townspeople whispered theories that grew wilder with each retelling. Inside a quiet conference room, Diane sat across from Mr. Cain, her legal pad filled with notes and highlighted timelines. "This changes our strategy, but it also means someone worked very hard to keep this buried." Mr. Cain nodded, still trying to process how quickly the tone of the hearing had shifted. For weeks, he had felt like he was drowning in accusations. Now, for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Back in the courtroom, the judge returned with a serious expression. The new information Diane submitted raised procedural concerns that could not be ignored. The judge announced that the court would allow additional time to investigate the authenticity of the documents and the circumstances under which earlier statements had been gathered. Gasps echoed across the room. This was no small delay. It meant the foundation of the case was being questioned. Outside, the news traveled fast. At Kelly's, conversations stopped mid-sentence as phones lit up with alerts. At the hospital, nurses and doctors huddled together between rounds, discussing what this could mean. Even Sonny, seated in a quiet corner of the Metro court, listened carefully as someone relayed the latest update. "This isn't just a delay, this is a crack in the whole case," he muttered. Meanwhile, the opposing counsel stepped aside to make urgent calls. Their earlier confidence had turned into visible concern. If Diane's evidence held up, it wouldn't just weaken their argument, it could expose mistakes that would be difficult to explain. Diane remained composed as she packed her files. She knew the hardest part was still ahead. Proving that the evidence was valid would require cooperation from witnesses who might now be nervous about speaking up. As she walked out of the courthouse, she noticed a familiar figure waiting near the steps. It was Alexis. "I heard," Alexis said quietly. "Whatever you found, it's big." Diane gave a slight nod. Big enough that someone didn't want it seen. That evening, Diane returned to her office to continue reviewing the material. As she flipped through the documents again, one detail caught her eye. A date that didn't match the official timeline presented earlier in court. It was small, easy to overlook, but it suggested that events had not unfolded the way everyone had been told. She circled the date with her pen. "This is where it starts," she whispered to herself. Across town, Mr. Cain sat alone, thinking about how close he had come to losing everything. Now he wondered who might be responsible for putting him in this position in the first place. The case had taken a turn no one expected, and Port Charles could feel it. The truth was beginning to surface layer by layer, and as Diane prepared for the next phase of the battle, she knew one thing for certain. Someone in Port Charles had a lot to hide, and they were about to be exposed.
The next morning, Diane arrived at her office before sunrise. The streets of Port Charles were still quiet, but her mind was already racing. She spread the documents across her desk again, aligning dates, witness notes, and the timeline presented in court. That one mismatched date kept pulling her attention. If the timeline had been altered, then someone had either made a serious mistake or intentionally reshaped the narrative from the very beginning. Her phone rang. It was Alexis. "I did some checking last night," Alexis said. "That date you mentioned, the person who logged the original report wasn't even on duty that day." Diane froze. "Are you certain?" "Positive. Hospital records, security logs, everything says they weren't there." Diane slowly leaned back in her chair. This was no longer just about overlooked evidence. This suggested that a key part of the case might have been constructed on inaccurate information. By mid-morning, Diane filed an urgent motion requesting access to additional records tied to the original investigation. The court granted limited approval, recognizing the seriousness of the discrepancies. Meanwhile, word spread again through Port Charles. At the Metro Court, Carly overheard two patrons discussing the case in hushed tones. At Kelly's, Joss asked Trina if they thought Mr. Cain might actually be telling the truth all along. Everyone seemed to sense that the case was unraveling into something much bigger than anyone expected. Back at the courthouse, the opposing counsel appeared tense. They knew Diane was closing in on something that could change the entire direction of the proceedings. When Diane received the newly released files that afternoon, she immediately noticed another irregularity, an amended statement that had been quietly updated days after it was first submitted, without any official notation explaining the change. She compared the two versions side by side. The difference was subtle, but significant. One version placed Mr. Cain in a location that supported the accusations. The earlier version did not. Diane's heart pounded. Someone had revised the narrative after the fact. She quickly called Mr. Cain to share what she had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before he finally spoke. "I knew something wasn't right," he said softly, "but I never imagined it went this deep." That evening, Diane met Alexis at the Metro Court to go over the findings. As they sat in a quiet booth, Alexis shook her head in disbelief.
"This could have serious consequences for more than just this case," Alexis said. "If this was done intentionally, it's not just a legal issue, it's a breach of trust across the board." Diane nodded. "And whoever did it is probably watching every move we make." Across town, an unknown figure sat alone, staring at a phone screen filled with notifications about the case. Their expression tightened with concern as they realized the situation was slipping out of control. They had never expected Diane to dig this far. Back at her office later that night, Diane prepared her next motion to present in court. She carefully organized the documents, knowing that once she revealed this information, there would be no turning back. The case was no longer just about defending Mr. Cain. It had become a search for the truth behind who altered the story and why. And when Diane returned to court, Port Charles would finally learn just how far someone had gone to change the course of justice. The courtroom felt heavier than before when Diane returned to present her latest findings. Every seat was filled, and the usual low chatter was replaced by a tense silence. Even the judge's expression hinted that this hearing could redefine the entire case. Diane stood, calm but resolute, and requested permission to submit a comparison of the original and amended statements tied to the investigation. As the documents were displayed, Diane carefully walked the court through the differences, line by line, word by word. What looked minor at first quickly revealed a troubling pattern. The earlier version placed Mr. Cain away from the scene at a critical time. The revised version subtly shifted details to suggest otherwise. There had been no formal notice of correction, no signature acknowledging the change, and no explanation for why it was altered. A murmur spread through the gallery. The judge leaned forward. "Counsel, are you suggesting these records were modified after submission without proper authorization?" Diane met the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor, and this alteration directly influenced the direction of this case." The opposing counsel objected, but their voice lacked conviction. They requested time to review the documents themselves, clearly caught off guard. As the hearing paused, tension spilled into the courthouse hallway. Reporters hurried to call in updates. Townspeople whispered theories that grew louder by the minute. Inside a side chamber, the judge requested both legal teams to meet privately. There, Diane laid out the full timeline she had reconstructed, when the original report was filed, when the changes appeared, and how those changes aligned with key developments in the investigation. The pattern was too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. "This calls into question the integrity of the entire case file," the judge said gravely. When the session resumed, the judge made a stunning announcement. The court would launch a formal inquiry into how the records had been handled. Until the review was complete, proceedings against Mr. Cain would be placed on hold. Gasps echoed through the room. Outside, news of the decision spread like wildfire. At the hospital, nurses stopped mid-conversation to read updates. At Kelly's, customers gathered around a phone to hear what had happened. At the Metro Court, Sonny quietly listened as the story unfolded, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't random," he said under his breath. "Someone had a reason." Meanwhile, Diane stepped outside for fresh air. She felt the weight of what she had set in motion. This was no longer just a defense. It was exposing a deeper problem that could affect many people in Port Charles. Alexis joined her on the courthouse steps. "You just shook the whole system," she said. Diane sighed. "And now whoever did this knows we're getting close." Across town, the same unknown figure watched the breaking news with growing unease. Papers were hastily gathered from a desk, a phone powered off. The sense of control they once had was slipping away. Back at her office later that night, Diane prepared her next motion to present in court. She carefully organized the documents, knowing that once she revealed this information, there would be no turning back. The case was no longer just about defending Mr. Cain. It had become a search for the truth behind who altered the story and why. And when Diane returned to court, Port Charles would finally learn just how far someone had gone to